the very end of 2020. Yes, thank you for asking the question. It is not only being recorded, we are being live streamed. I just got a big notice telling me that, and we are on YouTube. So the task force started at the very end of 2020, basically in response to what was happening during the pandemic. The wonderful people at the Institute for Security and Technology looked around and said, there's an awful lot of ransomware attacks happening against healthcare systems in a time when we're kind of reliant on those systems. I mean, we're always reliant on healthcare, but the pandemic kind of emphasized that, you may recall. And so their view was that, the IST view was that that really sort of elevated ransomware to being a national security issue. And at the same time, you may remember, we were welcoming in a new administration in the US. They'd already indicated that they were going to be much more focused on cybersecurity than the previous administration, which is a low bar. And so IST quite rightly thought, well, if we can pull together an effort that looks at what governments could be doing, so not what individual organizations should be doing, but what governments could be doing, then we can basically give a set of recommendations to the US government, the new administration as they're setting up. So that was the sort of idea of it. They pulled together just 100 of their closest friends that really came from sort of everywhere, all different aspects of people who had a view on ransomware, be it from law enforcement, cyber insurance, security companies, organizations that have been hit by ransomware, organizations that were worried about being hit by a ransomware, organizations from every sector of every size. Multiple governments participated. It was a truly sort of international and multi-stakeholder process. To use Michael Daniel, one of the other co-chairs' lines, we sprinted a marathon, so we worked really super hard on putting together this set of recommendations. There are 48 recommendations. I'm not going to go through them. That's the good thing. But they basically focus on how governments can deter and disrupt ransomware attacks, and also how they can help organizations prepare and respond at scale. We will drop some links into the chat for like the initial report. It's still relevant. 2 years old, but it's still relevant. Recommendations still stand. And also for some of the sub things that have happened since, some of the other kind of things. See, look how efficient they are. As I'm speaking, these links are coming through. So that's the basic gist about what the Ransomware Task Force is. The lovely people that I'm joined here by today are all adjuncts at the Institute for Security and Technology. And I hate to use the word, but I'm going to experts on ransomware in some way or other, which they will prove surely during the course of this session. I'll hand it over to them to introduce themselves. I'm just going to go as I see you on my screen. So Silas, can we start with you, please?
Sure. I'm Silas Cutler, adjunct senior cyber technical or threat advisor for IST and resident hacker for Stairwell.
Awesome, thank you. And then I'll go down to Marc.
Hi, I'm Marc Rogers, adjunct senior advisor for IST and the CTO of a sort of semi-stealth startup called Neighborhood.
Awesome, thank you very much. And last but by no means least, Jason.
Hi, Jason Kikta. I'm an adjunct senior technical advisor to IST, and then I'm also the CISO at Automox, and I teach at Johns Hopkins SAIS.
Awesome, thank you. So for this session, what we're going to do, and hopefully like this might be a thing that we do on a sort of ongoing basis ad hoc, as we think there's stuff worth talking about going on in the landscape. We want to keep these sessions really informal. So we've made it so that everybody can see the chat. You guys can add your own commentary, things that you're seeing, questions that you have. Feel free to sort of jump in and respond to each other. We are not going to do this as a heavily moderated session. I'm going to start off with one thing that Jason said the other day on a call that kind of, it's funny, I knew it, but I'd never heard it in that order of wording. And so it blew my mind. So the thing that Jason said was that there are an average 8 extortion-based attacks reported in the US every single day. And if you look at it globally, 12. That's insane. So, I mean, we've not clearly won this war. There's a lot still happening and a lot going on. So with that, what I'm going to do is just like, I'm going to ask the group, what are the main trends at the moment? What are we seeing happening? And then we're just going to kind of nerd out, basically. So I hope you enjoy the nerd. Thank you.
And Jen, I'm going to start by piling onto that and making it actually even worse. So I originally, as I am known for doing, so I originally calculated that number, and big shout out to ecrime.ch for compiling the statistics that I used to derive it. But I originally was in an argument with somebody back in May who was, saying basically that the U.S. government should ban ransomware payments, and then just allow reasonable exceptions and all that. And so, putting on my former government hat and thinking about, what would that take? I said, okay, how many U.S. victims to date? Or year to date? How many working days? Just working days, not all the days, just working days. And it came out to be, 8.3. And then the funny thing was, when I said it to you the other day, it was still 8.3. And then we looked at it again a couple of days later when we were typing it up formally in the announcement for this, and it was still 8.3. I don't think that number is magical, but it does show like there is a level of consistency there. So if a government wanted to ban ransomware payments and say, hey, we're just going to adjudicate the really needful cases. So like that is just going off of ransomware and data extortion, unique victims year to date inside the United States, 8.3 victims per working day. So that leaves out unknowns. There's a lot of pieces that aren't filled out there, and you would have to turn them really within 24 hours because if it takes 48, that's that much more that you have to do. You're going to have to maintain that rate to get through them all. And you're also, not only are the ransom timelines short, but companies' plans change. So, you could argue that that's about the right number because, well, there's some portion of those that that'll choose not to pay. And they're probably offsetting the ones who are unknown. Okay, fair enough. But then, you also have to consider like there are companies who choose not to pay right up until, the 11th hour when they realize, oh my God, that we didn't back this up. The backup's not feasible. And so now, within a very short period of time, they have to transition to actually paying in order to, keep their business viable or their organization and critical public services going. And so like, it is not something that is conducive to normal government due process, right? And that's the other thing is that this is not a matter of, the four of us sitting around and using our best judgment on this. Like this has to be legal due process to make that decision of you are allowed to pay, you are not permitted to pay. And there's going to be a lot of factors going into that. Companies are going to have to prepare these packages. If it doesn't go their way, they're going to sue. And one anecdote on the we're not going to pay until we're going to pay is I once watched a company while I was working back when I was still on active duty and at U.S. Cyber Command. There was a company that the FBI was helping out, and they were absolutely determined that they weren't going to pay. They had backups. They had great backups. They had, some on-site ones that they actually gotten a hold of, but they had some cold ones off-site, across the cloud, in a cloud data center somewhere. And they had tested, all different types of business user endpoints. They had tested servers. They had tested network devices. They tested it all. What they never tested was doing the entire company simultaneously right now today. And when they did the math, it came out to be, like weeks, like months that it would have taken at the data rates they could get and take in to do that restoration. So even when companies have done, their due diligence and are prepared and have, backup contingencies, like things still go sideways on them and they get locked into that. And at the rates and scope and scale we're talking about, it simply isn't feasible.
And just before Mark and Silas jump in, just really quickly, I just want to explain some context here. I know you're going to pile on, and I want you to, but very quickly. So what Jason's referencing is at the IST second anniversary event for the Ransomware Task Force back in May, I want to say, there was a session on payments, right? Because it's a recurring topic. It's a very popular topic. Lots of focus on it. And I think a couple of the governments that were participating mentioned they're still looking at the question of banning payments. And one of the sort of pushbacks that always comes up around this is that generally speaking, you have two categories of like most likely to pay, voted most likely to pay. And that's your small to medium businesses for whom a cyber attack can be an existential threat. They can literally go out of business over it. And then you've got your critical services. You've got your critical infrastructure and your essential services for whom disruption isn't really an option, right? Because you're critical. And so the theory has always been that if you ban payments, then attackers, rather than being like, oh, I guess I should go get a real job now, are much more likely to be like, well, let's test your mettle by going after your most likely to pay. So you're effectively painting a giant victim tag onto the backs of your small to medium businesses and your essential services. And so what the governments had said is, hey, if we ban payments, maybe we could have an exemption process, right? You could apply for an exemption to pay. And so what Jason's referencing when he's talking about the timelines that would involve and some of what you're seeing in the chat is a reference to that process of like, how would that actually work in practice? How would you possibly make that work in a timely way? There are also a number of governments that have banned payments across government. They've said, hey, you can't use taxpayer money to fund crime, which is a kind of a reasonable thing. And they're looking at like maybe extending it in different ways. Like, could you extend it to those that are suppliers to governments? I mean, it's the same problem, right? You're painting a target still, and they're going to test your mettle on that one. All right, I will now shut up and let Mark jump in. Sorry.
So I just wanted to emphasize something that Jason alluded to, which is that figure is actually a very conservative figure. We really don't know how big the iceberg is, because especially when you start talking about the much more easy to target victims, for example, smaller businesses, etc., they're far more likely to go ahead and do something without reporting it, because their existence may depend on keeping it quiet. Confidence in their brand, the legal issues they'll face, all of these other things represent a much more significant risk to them than coming forward and talking about it. And if you look at the law enforcement side, while we're improving things like how we respond to these cases in terms of investigating, there's still very little outcome in terms of help for the victims from those investigations. 9 times out of 10 they'll say, well, I'm sorry, we've identified this nebulous Russian group that's involved in this, and they're operating out of sanctuary, and well, sometime mañana there may be a prosecution. Great. Meanwhile, I've got to put my business back together. We are improving things like pre-notification. CISA's doing some great work in giving heads up to people about it. But there is zero work right now in who are the firefighters? Who's going to come in when you call and say, my business is on fire? How do I put it out? And until there is that kind of incentive, why are people going to come forward and report this stuff? They might as well keep their cards close to their chest, keep all the options on the table, and then do the best thing they can for their businesses.
So I'll add to that as well I used to be a very strong supporter of a complete blanket ban on ransomware payments. And I saw it as a way to put a hard line in place. But exactly that problem that the small and medium businesses face, where it's like they're going to handle it as best they can, and a lot of times without any firefighter support. The worry I've had as well with like something like a ransomware ban is the outcome of this looks to be something that's only going to put those people in a more dangerous position, because I can't think of many other situations in which companies and private individuals are put in a position where they are expected to negotiate or work directly with somebody that is actively extorting them. And to expect also that in addition to running their business and all the things they do on a daily basis, that they're keeping up with cybersecurity legislation. And when a ban comes in place, if they pay, it puts also them in a further risk, because now they may have inadvertently committed a crime in just trying to get their business back online. And And if my grandmother is watching, please stop sending gift cards to the pop-ups, because bluntly, like, that's also how some of this could end up, is ending up with companies in a further more dangerous position in which a criminal actor knows they've committed a crime and can extort them on that basis alone. So
we know that ransomware evolves really quickly. We've seen this. When they rang the bell that was Colonial, there was a massive ripple effect. They realized pretty quickly that if you hit a big enough target and ring a big enough bell, you're going to get all of the government sending all of their bees out to come and sting you. And so they've pivoted. And now they're going after the targets that are far less likely to report, far less capable of dealing with stuff, and they're hammering them. And so if we just make changes like that, all we should expect is them to pivot and pivot harder onto the people who can't respond, who can't deal with it. And so we're not making the problem go away. We're just burying the problem, and we're removing any possibility of help for the victims who get hit.
Yeah.
So we've got some questions, guys. Oh, sorry.
I was just going to tag on to what Mark said. When I talk to people about ransomware, I think the thing that the point I tend to make that seems to get a lot of attention and resonate with people, that stuns me the most, is that it's not about the ransomware. It is about monetizing access to a network. I have the skills to get access to your network. That should be worth money. Screw you, pay me. The ransomware is really immaterial. It is a means to an end. It just happens to be a rather effective means because it causes an all stop in business operations, whether it be an actual business or whether it be a government or a nonprofit organization. It puts them in a position where they are many times forced to pay. But that's why we also see, not all of it ends up in ransomware. Klopp was, doing ransomware and has, transitioned to pretty much purely data extortion. There's plenty of actors who do business email compromise type fraud with intercepting or moving payments. They don't care. And Eric Wegner in the audience brought up a great one, or excuse me, it was Sean Powers, that, yes, that is absolutely a thing where some of these actors will send a pen testing report to a victim afterwards to basically say like, hey, I gave you a non-consensual pen test, pay me for my services. And having been privy to some of these actor chats in the past, there are some of them who have convinced themselves that they are, basically doing a good for society by doing these, unauthorized pen tests, and then they demand a high payment because they're trying to teach those who can't internet well that, this is a costly thing and you really need to do better, which is really some mental gymnastics, but that's where their headspace is. And frankly, it doesn't matter if it's right or wrong because they're just going to keep doing it anyway.
Yeah, I mean, I think the point you make, like that point around that piece is really interesting, and I think it can definitely lead us off into a rabbit hole. But I think there's a piece there around, it's not a new thing, right? There are security vendors out there who do things like dark web monitoring that you didn't ask them to do. It's different if they're under contract, and then they come to you and they say, I found this data that looks like it's yours in the dark web, and for a fee I'll help you fix what's going on, right? And there's also researchers who are like, hey, I found this bug, what's it worth to you? And I will just say, as a side note, be careful that you don't trip over that line called extortion. It is like there is a definite distinction here, and I am all pro independent research. I totally think that researchers deserve to get paid for their time. There is a lot to be said for how you put that proposition to people and where your expectation lies on whether you're doing research or you're doing extortion. So just be careful with that. But that's a bit of a rabbit hole. So I'll put it to one side.
Yeah, I run into that all the time when reaching out to companies trying to let them know. And it is something, even just as it's a underdeveloped area, I've found in the broad conversation of security, because like there is scripts that I've written out where it's like, ooh, I can't mention this too early because they're going to think I'm a sales call. But those carpet bombing emails of like, there's a cross-site scripting bug that's only possible under this condition, make it harder for everybody else to to be taken seriously when making those reports.
Yeah, I mean,
yeah, I mean, go for it, Mark.
I was just going to say, during the pandemic, an organization I was part of, the CTI League, we were finding a couple of thousand vulnerabilities in healthcare every month. And one of the hardest problems we had was reporting them, like going into organizations saying, "Hi, I'm a friendly hacker, and I found all these bugs in your system," doesn't generally respond well. And in fact, even when we had law enforcement go in and try and support us, organizations just don't know how to deal with that. So it's kind of a nebulous one. I did also want to very quick.
I was just going to say, I've had calls from researchers saying, "Help, I'm being threatened with somebody going to the FBI," and all I was trying to do was disclose something to them. And yeah, it's difficult all the way around. So just be cautious.
Yeah, I just wanted to also touch on the question that I think Jason answered a little bit about from the anonymous attendee. I think you should never underestimate the ability for criminals to innovate their cash out. So right now,
sorry, Mark, we're the only people who could see the question, so can you just recap?
Right, okay. So the question says, take Jason's point, problems with a ban with carve-outs, and Mark's about victims' desire to report. However, they're a blanket ban. What's the supposed story about how these victims would pay secretly without reporting to government? And then it also goes on to talk about aren't the threats targeting sensitive personal information in Minneapolis schools, threats to docs, DCP, police confidential information are already an example of the ransomware gangs that are willing to twist the knife. And so there's kind of two parts to that. One part, and it's all about innovation. Like, don't underestimate the criminals' ability to innovate. They're using cryptocurrency because it's the most effective mechanism to cash out right now. They will find other, they will find other mechanisms. If it means getting you to go to buy gift cards, they will get you to go and buy gift cards. Like, I would like to buy 20,000 gift cards.
Or put you on a payment plan, right? Small amounts on a regular basis.
There is always a way to solicit you to make a payment if they want to do it. And there have been ways to evade currency payment tracking for decades, for hundreds of years, in fact. And the other part about twisting the knife, it's not just twisting a knife. We're seeing a genuine fork in ransomware tactics. One tactic still focuses on the operational disruption, blow the things up, burn it to the ground, and you're paid to save your business from that. But another one has realized, well, so there's three actually. Another one has realized, do that and twist the knife of data extortion, and you'll get them to pay faster and do a double tap. But there's a third one that's now saying, you know what? Actually, we don't need the sophisticated encryption stuff. We can just get into the network, and if we get access to their crown jewels, the most sensitive data, just threatening them with that is enough to get payments. And we're watching these three different methods spread out and become more effective ways to get money.
There's another fork as though, which I think relates as well, which relates to this, which is, during the pandemic, we saw some attacker groups take a position where they said, we're not going to go after critical infrastructure, or we're not going to go after healthcare in particular, right? We saw a bunch of other attacker groups that were like, cool, more for us. And so I think, what we see today, the examples that you provided in your question around some of the more kind of egregious threats, they do exist today. And mostly they seem to come from a bit of a like spray spaghetti at the wall and see what sticks kind of an approach, rather than being super, super targeted. That's not to say there aren't any super targeted ones, but they mostly seem not to be more targeted. What we're saying is, if you ban payments, you up the level, the risk of them being targeted specifically at those entities. And so we're not going to see like a few that are the standouts that we see headlines on. We're going to see that level go up. That's the theory behind it, right? So just to clarify that that point. We did also get another question. Eric said, and hi to Eric, he said, what are your thoughts about reporting, requiring reporting rather than banning payments? I feel like all of us are going to be like,
I'm completely in favor of it, but I think that it needs to be done smartly, and this is where I have a little bit of concern with the way the SEC did their recent.
I was waiting. I was like, he's going to say
I could go way down the rabbit hole beating up on that one, but it required
Can you just
reporting.
give like a quick summary of what the SEC did? Sorry, I think you were about to.
It essentially requires businesses to, report, breaches within, I think it's 48 hours, I think it is, or it's a very short period of time. And then I saw an article today that Jen Easterly was excited because, hey, now we're going to start getting good data on ransomware. I don't think that's what's going to happen. I think when you put the time, like, love reporting, all in favor of it, far past due, but it needs some calibration, because if you put the bar too low, you're not going to get. And I thought, I listened to Risky Business, and Patrick Gray did a great articulation of this, where he joked around one week, a week before last, that you're going to get every general counsel in the world coming up with all kinds of mental gymnastics to not report. And then someone set them straight and said, no, what's going to happen is that the US government is going to be drinking from the fire hose of crap, and it is not going to stop. So, this is a good step. It's not going to work out the way they think that it is. The good news is I think they're going to figure that out really, really quickly, and get it calibrated to a more appropriate place. But reporting all day long, we need better data. Everyone is desperate for better data, and that's probably the good first step, because a lot of the challenge up till now is whether they are, whatever we do to counter ransomware, whether it be more on the security blue side of things, or whether it be a little more on the offensive disruption side of things, we don't have solid data as a society on whether on how much that is changing the equation, and whether it's making things better or worse, on what's more effective than another measure. We have to start getting better data so that we can make rational decisions.
I'm going to go against the grain a little bit and say I completely agree with what you're saying about better data, but I'm totally on the fence when it comes to the reporting, because I don't know that we have the capability to do the reporting right. I think, like, first of all, there's the fire hose problem. Like, whichever agency takes it is going to get this massive influx of data that I'm not sure that they have the right setup to handle. And I'm also not sure that it's going to be good quality enough for them to even process it in a way, even if they had the right setup to handle it. The other problem is we have historically seen issues with reporting things in a mandatory fashion. That means bad guys who are inside networks get tipped off. And if you don't do it properly, what you end up doing is tipping your hand before you are able to investigate some of the more serious attacks. And the quicker you force that reporting, the more risk there is in it. And so we have to think about the mechanism of reporting as well, so that we don't blow these chances. If we end up with, like, I don't know, call 1-800 ransomware and say that I've been hit with something, I guarantee you that's going to blow up in our faces. We need to think about the most tactical ways to do that. And we also need to think about, number one, it needs to be blameless reporting. So then we need to offer protection for the companies that are coming forward with this stuff. It can't be held against them. And number two, we need to come up with incentives for reporting. Do they get some kind of protection? Do they get some kind of limited liability for reporting? Obviously, you don't want to protect them from incompetence or willful ignorance, but you shouldn't create a scenario where people are forced to come forward and then get smacked about the head because they do come forward. That just makes the whole situation worse.
I'll also add that if you turn it into something that's a mandatory reporting as well, I feel like I put money that there will be actors that submit the reports on behalf of the companies they've targeted, just as another lever of, like, things they can hold over and try and force a victim to pay further. I.e., if you mandated ransomware reporting, ransomware actors report it as we know you didn't report already, so we've submitted it for you, or are going to submit it to put you in further hot water. Yeah.
So a question to you guys, and then I want to turn to some of the questions that we've got coming in. when we were putting together the report, the original report 2 years ago, it was really sort of in the context of the time when the EU was looking at updating NIS, the Network and Information Systems Directive, and there was like a lot of discussion generally about incident reporting to governments and what that should look like, and there was a lot of sort of discussion around why people don't want to disclose to the government, right? Like where the challenges on that come from. And so one of the things that the RTF report suggested is that maybe the disclosure shouldn't go to a government. Maybe there should be like an independent international entity that's literally just exists to like take in this information, anonymize it, aggregate it, share out data, and then also make sure that like people get the information they need, they get the connections they need, but they're not feeling like they're going to a government to report. Do you think that would help, or do you think that's just yet another layer of complexity?
I think it would be helpful as a, good first step, because I think right now we need to get to, as Mark articulated, sort of a no harm, no foul, incentivized reporting mechanism. Because again, if we wanted to, let's say, when the SEC is the one imposing the reporting requirement, that implies SEC type penalties. And
right.
I don't think the government and I don't think industry right now could articulate what a company did wrong in many cases without looking at the technical specifics, and make that a hard and fast rule. I was looking at an incident response recently for a ransomware incident, and the company had EDR. The company had an MDR company helping them. Like they did a lot of things on paper right, and they still got hit. So it's not so simple to say who's doing things right, who's doing things wrong. And so someone who doesn't have the power to adjudicate right versus wrong, and whose job it is to take it in, synthesize it, anonymize it, and then push out meaningful statistics, is probably a good way to lower the temperature on both sides of the equation, so that we can start, orienting on what exactly are we talking about here, because there are a lot of things that we just still don't know at scale.
So then do we just go build it, and then the governments will say, oh, you should report to that? Like what needs to happen? If we build it, will they come?
Not a bad idea. Yeah, I think honestly, there would, that might be the best way to go, is that someone just goes and builds the thing, and then gets support for mandated reporting to it with, there'll have to be a lot of transparency behind it of safeguards and how that data is going to be protected, and how it's going to be used, and how it's going to be deleted and destroyed once it's been anonymized appropriately. But I think if we sit around and wait for the governments of the world to go, this is a really good idea, and get together and come up with it on its own, it's probably not going to happen for another decade.
I'll also note as well, like when it comes to the fire hood that a feed like that will produce as well, I don't know if any government is equipped well to be able to handle that, and then what is still a complicated process for them execute on that data, like in useful ways, like distributing out known copies of ransomware lockers to EDR companies to ensure that everybody has a standard baseline that they're defending against. Trying to ask them to not only collect the metrics but then redistribute is a lot to ask. So I agree with Kikta on this pretty heavily.
Okay, so moving on. So there's a question here from Mudge. There's a level of sophistication for ransomware actors to understand what data is of value / worth paying for. What are some of the most boneheaded attempts to demand money for data? Brackets demonstrating lack of understanding of value, and what are some of the generally always valuable data, and what are the most insightful examples of identifying uniquely valuable data to extort for a specific target?
That is a very Mudge question. I'll say that I don't know that I would call it boneheaded. It's maybe a bit boneheaded and maybe unrealistic, but the one that I see actors being mistaken about most often is PII. They are convinced that PII is still something that people are really going to pay for. And I think that they don't appreciate that we've all kind of become numb to it as a society. My data all went away during OPM. I don't care anymore.
I will say,
you know,
as a counterpoint to that, right? We recently had a disclosure in the UK that the Electoral Commission had been hacked and that people's names and addresses were stolen. And it was a huge story. And people kept saying to me, like, oh my God, should people be panicking? And I was like, well, your name and address is pretty much public information, so no. I mean,
right?
You can literally go to the Electoral Commission and pay to access that information.
Yes.
So what they did is a freebie.
I think there's the flip side to that, which is the smarter group targeting is anything that has emotional ties to it. And that's why, I think that's why that one was hot, because it had an emotional connection.
Right, and it's elections.
And the same, we see a ton of ransomware actors now targeting schools and targeting hospitals. Why?
Orphanages.
There's a huge emotional, the emotional attachment equals good payout.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
that's awesome to see one.
I agree with Mark. You said something that I want to make sure gets highlighted. Like, what the actor takes actually says more than a lot of other things. Because the thing is what I often see is an actor grabbing a bunch of users' home directories, like from a shared network drive, and being like, "Aha, we have everything." But no. Like, if you're hitting a manufacturing company, like user documents, which may include like internal processes, like the hopefully backups of it, but that isn't config files for engineering equipment or design specifications in some setting. Like I see less of those things unless it's just coincidentally picked up. When someone actually takes the time to be like, I know what is the core value of data that is from this company, and that's what gets posted. Like, to me, that's a better indication of a sophisticated actor instead of just they're always going to go for something. Yeah.
And I think, and it goes back to our, innovation and evolution concerns of, going back to what we started with, governments banning payments, but potentially granting exemptions, those really big emotional events where people are very inclined to pay are going to also tend to be the ones that get the most exemptions. And all we're doing is teaching them, this is the soft underbelly. This is what we really truly care about. Like, go after that. Like, they're going to look at who gets to pay and who doesn't get to pay. And they're just going to look for more things that look like who got to pay. And that is now, counterpoint to that is that does reduce our problem set somewhat for what where we need to focus, right? If it's schools and hospitals and orphanages and things that we're really sort of core critical infrastructure. I always hate the term critical infrastructure because like everything's critical infrastructure. This podcast is critical infrastructure. But the like sort of core critical infrastructure that's necessary to day-to-day life, if we narrow it down to that, yes, we reduce the scope of what we need to improve upon. But back to my point, they're still monetizing access. They're still able to get broad access, and they're going to find a different mechanism to monetize that isn't banned or isn't as detectable or is, easier for them.
At the risk of providing a ransomware recipe for success, I think the sophisticated actors have realized that the unsophisticated emotional things are the right things to go after, whereas the less sophisticated attackers do the grabble and try to grab the technical stuff. I've looked into several very big incidents. Like a couple that stand out were telecom centric, and I have a telecoms background, so I know some of the stuff. When I see the data, I understand what is there. And they completely missed the point. And they went and grabbed a whole bunch of business docs, and they totally missed the things that would have actually hurt a telco. And I think that's a good example of an actor / affiliate that really didn't know. I mean, none of them are ever going to be experts in the spaces that they're targeting, but they didn't do any kind of research into the industry that they were going after. And so they just grabbed what looked impressive, which was the business stuff. And the smarter ones go after the stuff that they know is simpler, that's emotional, that is going to really get people to pay attention. And then they don't have to worry about doing that extra due diligence.
And I think it's important to point out too that the vast majority of bad actors in this space are unsophisticated. They're actually really unsophisticated, and even some of the ones who have made somewhat of a larger public name for themselves, they're really not all that impressive. But that doesn't mean that they're not a problem. And so,
well,
like, go ahead.
Well, I think the other thing is, like, it doesn't even matter if they're sophisticated because they don't need to be. Right. And so, like, actually, they might be super sophisticated, but they're not going to make their lives more complicated and expensive than they need to be. And right now, throwing spaghetti at the wall actually works. Like, they make tons of money off throwing spaghetti at the wall. So why would they do something that's more costly, more complicated, slower? They wouldn't. So, yeah, what we see is not a huge amount of, like, highly sophisticated stuff because we don't need to. That's the depressing thing.
I'll say though.
Aren't you glad this is not the last note of this?
I'll throw a very backwards view of it. I actually wish we saw more sophisticated actors versus the hordes of less sophisticated, because one of the key things that I always look for, like the attacks, the techniques that you use on a day-to-day thing, like while those are important, the area that to me is always the biggest indicator of an actor's sophistication is how they handle a problem. If there's an error that occurs from running a tool or some unforeseen situation happens, how they react makes all the difference. And there's a video from somebody recording a remote desktop session with APT3 back in the day, and they triggered some sort of critical system error, but they adapted, they moved it out of the way, they adjusted, they cleaned up, and they executed beautifully. I would prefer that, because with ransomware actors whose experience is playing a few of the online CTFs and then a 1 week intensive training for over talks
and reading a step-by-step guide to Cobalt Strike.
Yeah, those are the people I don't want. Don't want YOLO shooting out implants on critical infrastructure networks. I would much prefer at least sophisticated actor that knows how to account for an emergency instead of just hot disconnecting and running. Because a sophisticated actor is going to have just as much motivation to keep things recoverable so that they ensure that, one, they get paid and their reputation doesn't get harmed.
So a data point on sophisticated versus unsophisticated. First of all, we should separate the ransomware group from the ransomware affiliates. The ransomware group is operating infrastructure. They are literally a SaaS provider. They are offering a platform that gives people, the affiliates, support. It gives them a 24-hour hotline. It helps them with negotiation. They have an IT support console. They get full code that they can deploy. They get a contract. They get a license agreement, all of that stuff. The ones who are doing the breaking in are generally the affiliates, and their sophistication is really variable. But the vast majority of them are breaking in through exposed infrastructure, weak credentials, and really simple stuff like that. That doesn't necessarily define whether or not they're sophisticated, because it's easy, use it. In fact, I would say the most sophisticated actors are smart and go after the easy things, because an easy target is far less likely to be able to respond and therefore far more likely to pay out. But if you look at some of these affiliates and look at the ones that adapt to things like new vulnerabilities that suddenly explode on the horizon and start leveraging them, things for like lateral movement inside networks, those are the sophisticated ones to keep an eye on. And they are absolutely in the minority. So anyone out there who's worried about being hit by ransomware, you're not got to be worried about entry through a 0-day. You're going to be worried about entry through someone selling access to one of your employees, or an exposed credential in a breach, or an exposed piece of infrastructure. But once it comes to moving around inside your network, the more sophisticated ones are going to use those vulnerabilities like the log4js, and they're going to start moving laterally using that stuff.
Well, and I think that's, this is something that we need to come to terms with on the private sector side in industry, is that we've made a lot of cybersecurity improvements over the last 5, 10, 15, 20 years. Like, there is a lot, Mudge is in the audience today, right? And buffer overflows, not really very viable as a tactic anymore, because we've made that very hard. We've made that very expensive. We've built in a lot. There are a lot of inbuilt protections to programming languages and compilers and operating systems, and on and on and on it goes, to stop that entire class of attacks. And what we've done over time is we have made targeted attacks far more difficult, right? I need to get into that place specifically. Now, governments have just responded by putting more money in research and being a little more organized at the problem. But what we have not really made good traction on is opportunistic access, right? I need to break into a thing. With any vulnerability that comes out, I can break into a thing. And that's where we've seen, as Marcus was referring to, the rise of these mass exploitation events where, we'll watch, these things tick along from, a CVE comes out, you start seeing development on GitHub, and then, someone drops a POC, a proof of concept, and then off to the races we go. And, mass exploitation at internet scale, and, just cross your fingers and hope that you're the one who gets hit with the cryptocurrency miner, which is basically a public service, because no self-respecting ransomware actor, let alone government agency, is going to coexist with a crypto miner. So if you get that, you're lucky. You're probably clean from the other stuff, but too often you get the really bad stuff that does something other than drive up your electric bill or your AWS bill. So that's where I think we also need to sort of go back to the drawing board on the industry side and say, how do we affect that systemic change? How do we make it so that, entire types of opportunistic attacks are harder, or, we're not going to solve it, right? But we can, introduce a lot more friction into it. And I don't feel like we're doing enough research there, because everyone is, it's all about, my customer directly, like, what can this do for you? And rather, like, how do we raise all boats?
So I don't know if this is a good standard example. Looking at Log4j, we saw the massive explosion, like Jason was just talking about. And then we saw the spaghetti against wall attempts as various different groups tried to leverage Log4j for things like lateral movement and stuff. And no one really managed to do a ton of super interesting stuff with it. Some of that, I think, is probably because Log4j was actually quite a difficult exploit. It was really weird in terms of knowing which bit of infrastructure you're going to exploit and how it was going to respond. But about 6 or so months down the line, we then started seeing Lazarus Group and some others really starting to hit things effectively. And so it took them, 6 to 8 months to take a well-known, well-documented, loud exploit and then work out how to build it into their workflow so they could do damage with it. What that tells us is there's opportunity here. If we can get better at fixing some of these opportunistic vulnerabilities, fixing some of the hygiene stuff, there is absolutely an opportunity for us to get in and nip these workflows in the bud.
So I'll also say that this is one of those areas that I feel sad about over the years, because this is an area that I believe that this is something indicator sharing at proper speeds could be seriously helpful in causing disruption of. So when an attack like Hafnium or Log4j kicks up, having feeds of people, because there are people who are posting on Twitter every day saying, hey, saw this attacker, Gray Noise does fantastic work tracking all of the different observed broad exploitation systems, or systems being used for broad exploitation. If those could be actually put into place and delivered to a broad set of networks in real time and then removed so that they don't linger forever, that's where I think there is still the ability for us to actually start to disrupt some of these broad attacks in progress. Because otherwise right now, waiting on a write-up a week later, it's not going to help. And at that point, everybody should already have IR services coming in, because the speed in which these things can be pushed out is minutes to hours. Like looking back at the Hafnium things, like they ran their attacks over a couple of days.
Woo!
Capabilities now can have that done in minutes. Cross the entire IPv4 space, blast the exploit to everybody, and it just ends up as a shell party. So
So jumping into some of the questions that have come in, I just want to answer one from Steph about a good starting point to gather better data. I think there are some solid opportunities. And I think perhaps we're using the fist before the carrot here. Working in the CTI League.
Fist, isn't it meant to be the stick?
Well, it's more working the CTI League, we got a ton of good data from people coming forward and talking to us because they knew we were neither a government entity nor incentivized to do anything that would harm them, and that we were there to help. And so they were willing to come forward. And I think using that pattern of engaging with potential victims and opening dialogues with them and collecting data that way is going to be much more fruitful than forcing them to come forward. The other thing is to start looking at the mechanisms that we can use to provide support for these organizations. Can we go and talk to MSSPs or to other entities and incentivize them to go and talk about this stuff and provide support in some way? Or can we talk to other parties who can provide some support? Because I think if people had an opportunity to get some kind of support they felt was beneficial, there'd be far more coming forward. I got actually more notice about victims when we did an RTF AMA on Reddit than I've seen doing stuff in the sort of the official government ransomware task force things. So I think the unofficial channel is an option that we need to focus on building out before we build out these mandatory official stick methods.
So I'd actually be curious, can you share what type of things that potential victims were bringing forward as well? Because I feel like I have assumptions about what I would like to receive from these things, but expecting like a victim organization to have hashes and like some analysis is way, yeah.
So bear in mind, most of the time this was firefighting. So a lot of them were coming forward and saying, help, like we've been hit by this. A couple of the notable hospitals that got hit during the pandemic, we had low-level IT people in their organizations reach out to us and say, help. And it was a very frustrating experience for everyone because a low-level IT person doesn't have the authority to really achieve anything. And their bosses weren't willing to talk to them about it because they were having a closed-door session with their lawyers. And it was just difficult. But we had some pretty early details on how they suspected they got in, which systems had been impacted first. And if we'd actually formalized this a bit better, we could have come up with some processes for what are the things that we can collect on some of these initial engagements. And I think if that path is opened up and we say like, hey, you can call us and we will give you honest advice. We can't take responsibility for what's happened to you. And obviously we probably can't bring the fire engine to your house, but we will do everything in terms of guiding you in the right direction. And we're not the government and we are here to help. I think you're going to get a lot more people engaging.
Yeah, I mean, I think the problem here is that we can't destigmatize this, and we'd like to, right? We would like to make it so that there isn't that sort of feeling that being a victim puts you in a minority, when actually that's not true, and that it somehow is going to reflect. I mean, it does reflect on your credibility with your customers. It does hurt trust, and so fundamentally, organizations just don't want this to be public. They don't want governments to know. They don't want to involve law enforcement. They just want to sweep it under the carpet. And we can't, we can get rid of other sticks. We're not going to, but we could get rid of theoretically other sticks like regulatory impact. But we actually don't know how to change the dialogue around this to destigmatize and get rid of that stick. We can't normalize this in the public consciousness. And so you do have to find, I completely agree with Mark, you have to find value add that you can offer, and you also have to make it seem to people as though they can trust the disclosure and that it's not going to be public, it's not going to hurt customer confidence, it's not going to be a pile-on of media, it's going to be private, it's going to be kept private, and that they'll get something out of it. But the problem is that even if you do that, even if you offer that, you set up this hallowed entity that is independent and does all of that, how you reach small to medium businesses is a whole other mystery that I don't think we're even close to solving, how we reach into them. We have 5 minutes left, and I know there's loads of conversation, but I also know that you guys wanted to talk about LockBit. And I feel like that might be a cheerier note to end on, honestly. A little bit of like implosion of organized crime.
So I'm really happy to see, smiling, looking, the office meme of Jim smiling through the office blinds, like watching LockBit go sideways. And John DiMaggio did a wonderful report on what's happening within that group, although it absolutely does not mean that they're out for the count, but that they're on rocky roads and have an uncertain future. I think also the example of LockBit, who is the most prolific ransomware actor in the world right now by orders of magnitude, I think it gives us important lessons. And that is, my core contention when it comes to having formerly done actor disruption for a living. I think it's a good thing, and we need it as a country. And I think that government and industry, especially working together, can do great things there. But it will only take us so far. And when you look at LockBit and who they're able to victimize, you can beat LockBit. Like, LockBit is very beatable. If you're running a business or an organization, it's possible. It's just that, it requires some investment. It requires some focus on, covering your fundamentals, on better segmentation, on better, monitoring and detection. And, you have to make it a priority and, resource it well. But, over time, these groups will eventually, like, none of them are stable in the long term. The problem we have is when one blows apart, they tend to reform. The pieces kind of scatter, and then they gravity takes hold and they reform, and now you've got other groups. But it should give us optimism. Too often I think people get wrapped up in, this is an impossible problem and it'll never go away. I agree with it'll never go away. Like, we'll never get to zero, but that's okay. There are many areas of human life where there's risk, but we need to, figure out how to get it down to a dull roar. And a lot of it is achievable, but people just need to have better guidance on what they should be doing.
I completely agree. And I think I'd like use the LockBit as a sort of closing remark on it, echoing something that Mudge has said. Like, I don't want people to think that ransomware is unstoppable. I think it will change. Crime always changes. When you put pressure on one thing, it pops up in another. But we should take LockBit as an example of something that some of us have been pushing for a while. And that is actually, if you hit the ecosystem and if you hit the fabric that makes these groups cohesive, you're actually going to have much more impact than if you go after a couple of named random Russians who you're probably not going to arrest, or maybe only arrest if they make OPSEC failures. LockBit's failure seems to be systemic. They have had problems with their infrastructure. They've had problems with resourcing staff. They've had disgruntled developers leaking code. They're trying to steal source code from other ransomware groups to fill in gaps they have. Like, ransomware groups are like businesses. And like businesses, they need a sustainable ecosystem to thrive in. And if we crush that ecosystem and starve them of resources, they will fall apart. LockBit, massive. They're falling apart because of exactly these problems. And I would say a lot of it's probably come because of the Russia-Ukraine conflict and all the sanctions and other things that have just made their lives really complicated and difficult. But we can replicate that. We can do that. And the last thing is, Mudge kindly threw some figures about like the number of highly sophisticated groups out there. And what he said is the top tier teams, say the top 15, are hitting about 300 targets a year. So assume about 3,000 a year. Compare that to the thousands that are being hit by the lower kind of tier teams and what they're targeting. The vast majority of ransomware actors can be stopped with relatively simple things that are within our power to do. And we will be guilty of not solving the problem if we don't keep hammering on things like hygiene, on putting in place good security authentication, and on putting in place decent internal network security.
Okay, so on that note, thank you to everyone for joining us. As you can tell, we clearly could have gone for easily another hour. And I think that suggests that maybe we will do another one of these at some point in the not too distant future. So thank you so much for joining us. If you have topics you particularly want us to cover, please feel free to email Jason, since he shared his email. Or you can tweet at IST or use LinkedIn, and we will definitely take that on board for the next one.